During the final years of my high school, I worked as a delivery driver for a well-known fast food establishment in my hometown. Many of my friends also held positions there, but we were intentionally given separate shifts to prevent any mischief. Although it took away some of the enjoyment, the extra income was a welcome addition. Most days, my work was uneventful, and there were no remarkable stories to share about my job. However, one particular night stood out from the rest. It happened over the weekend when I was scheduled to work until 10 p.m. Orders were coming in steadily, and I found myself engaged in a constant cycle of deliveries. I would pick up an order, drive to the customer's house, and repeat the process without pause. Around 9 p.m., I received an order that took me on a different route than my usual deliveries. As I drove, I gradually realized that I was heading towards an area with fewer houses than I was accustomed to. Unlike the bustling neighborhoods I usually delivered to, this place was tranquil, surrounded by trees and a quiet road. Although I didn't think much of it at the time, I started to wonder when the GPS indicated that I was just 1 minute away from the destination. I couldn't identify any landmarks. It was a desolate area with nothing but trees and the road. Despite the unusual circumstances, I followed the GPS until it claimed that I had arrived, which was just a quarter-mile further down the road. I pulled over and quickly scanned my surroundings, just in case I had overlooked something. I then decided to call the customer. The phone rang for a considerable amount of time before they finally answered. I explained the situation, mentioning that I had arrived at the address they had provided, but something seemed off. I hoped that it was merely a typographical error or some other mistake on their part. However, when the customer repeated the same address, it matched the one displayed on my GPS. What happened next caught me completely off guard. The customer said, "Wait, I think I see you." I looked ahead and noticed a person waving at me from the side of the road. I drove up to them, but an uncomfortable feeling gnawed at my gut. I rolled down the window, and the individual immediately began apologizing, explaining that the address could sometimes be challenging to locate. They pointed behind them, indicating that their house was down a seemingly half-beaten dirt path that cut through the forest. I offered a polite smile, handed over the delivery through the window, and they thanked me with a smile. I watched them in my rear-view mirror as I pulled back onto the road and executed a U-turn. The entire encounter struck me as strange. However, not even a minute into my return drive, I began to sense that something was amiss. My car started to wobble and lean to the right, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. It became perilous to continue driving, so I pulled over. Without hesitation, I called roadside assistance. I wasn't sure what was causing the issue yet, and I didn't want to take any unnecessary risks, considering the unsettling feeling in my gut. After concluding the call, I got out of the car and inspected my tires. It turned out that my front right tire was damaged, the same tire closest to where the mysterious person had been standing. Connecting the dots quickly, I looked back down the road I had come from and saw a figure approaching. I hurried back into my car and locked the doors as the person neared, likely aware of the situation. As the individual got closer, I deliberated whether to attempt driving on the damaged tire. Just when I was uncertain about my next move, a stroke of luck arrived in the form of a passing truck. It pulled up behind me, and the occupants asked if I was okay. I noticed the mysterious person quickly walking back in the direction they had come from. I seized the opportunity to confide in the individuals from the truck about my suspicions, and they stayed with me until the roadside assistance truck arrived just a minute later. I got the police involved, and it was no surprise to discover that the name and address the mysterious customer had provided were fake. What the individual was trying to accomplish remained a mystery, but the circumstances suggested that it was more than a simple robbery. During my 17th year, I was employed at my parents' local diner. It wasn't a bustling establishment, but it kept us afloat. My responsibilities included manning the cash register, occasionally helping with waiting tables, and assisting with cleaning. My parents were accommodating, allowing me flexible hours to accommodate my school commitments. During the summer, I worked full 40-hour weeks, mainly in the afternoons until closing. This marked my second year at the diner, and for the latter half of the summer, my parents assigned me the closing duties for most nights. These tasks involved spending an additional 15 to 30 minutes after the restaurant's closing hours to count the day's earnings and tidy up. It wasn't particularly challenging, but it was a little extra responsibility. One Friday evening, my father and I experienced a somewhat busier night than usual. Apart from the assistant cook, we were the sole employees present at closing time. After assisting me briefly, my father locked up the front doors and headed home for the night. I had plans to meet a friend after work, so I hurried to complete my tasks. Once I finished, it was a few minutes past 11. I exited through the rear door, which led to a small employee parking lot. I was taken aback when I spotted an individual standing right next to my car, peering through the windows in an attempt to see inside. "Hey, get away from my car!" I shouted, and the man briefly revealed his face before darting into the nearby trees behind the parking lot. I didn't get a good look at him, but I distinctly remember his long, disheveled, and patchy beard. He had a peculiar appearance, and his presence left me feeling extremely uneasy as I drove away. A few days later, I found myself working the closing shift with just the assistant cook. It was a slow weekday night, and we were only 20 minutes away from closing. Suddenly, a man walked through the restaurant's entrance and seated himself at a table without saying a word. Our diner operated on the system of ordering, at the register before finding a seat, so his behavior was quite unusual. I waited for a few minutes, then approached his table and inquired if he'd like to place an order before we closed. To my surprise, I recognized him as the same individual from a few nights earlier, with his long and patchy beard. I was so preoccupied with my thoughts that I didn't even register his response. Attempting to assert myself and ask him to leave, I found my words stumbling out with a complete lack of confidence. Ignoring my request, he maintained eye contact and requested a dark roast coffee. Disconcerted and unsure of how to proceed, I turned and placed the order. I toyed with the idea that this might all be a misunderstanding, but deep down, I knew I was only trying to convince myself that there was no reason to be frightened. The man continued to sit at the table, staring ahead until his coffee was ready. When I brought his coffee to him, I reminded him that the diner was closing in 10 minutes, and he'd need to depart shortly. He remained silent, offering no response. I returned to the assistant cook, someone I hadn't spoken much with before, and shared my concerns about the unsettling presence of this man. He patted me on the shoulder and instructed me to begin cleaning, then went to the front of the diner. From my vantage point behind the counter, I observed as he kindly asked the man to leave. The man stood up, briefly making eye contact with me across the restaurant, and then turned and headed for the exit. As he reached for the door handle to leave, a conspicuous object became visible, a gun wedged into the back of his belt. Alarmed by this shocking revelation, I thanked the assistant cook and provided him with a detailed account of the situation, ensuring he understood my apprehensions. Without hesitation, he called the police, and though they didn't apprehend the man, he never returned to the restaurant. I remain grateful for the assistant cook's kindness, whose identity I've chosen to protect for his privacy. He could have easily left for the night and left me to deal with the unsettling situation alone. His compassion likely saved me from a potentially dangerous encounter that night. I started a new job last year at a supermarket, working the overnight shift to restock the store's shelves. This particular store was part of a local chain with several locations, but they weren't massive stores by any means. Typically, we had a team of 2 or 3 stockers to prepare the store for the next day. I had previous experience with similar jobs, so I wasn't new to overnight stocking. One night, I arrived for my shift at 10 p.m., but received the unfortunate news that one of the guys had called off, leaving only me and my manager, Yuri, to handle the night's work. Yuri was a reserved guy, and he didn't engage in much conversation, so it usually made for a rather uneventful shift. However, about an hour into the shift, while I was working in the chip aisle with my earbuds in, Yuri appeared at the front of the aisle, wearing a concerned expression. I pulled my earbuds out and asked if everything was okay. He seemed to be breathing heavily and inquired if I had seen anyone else in the store. I told him I hadn't. and he explained that he thought he saw someone walk past his aisle a minute ago, but when he investigated, no one was there. I could tell he was uneasy, but he attempted to brush it off and resumed his work. Once he left, I couldn't help but think that it was the most I'd ever spoken to him, which led me to believe he might have genuinely seen something. I became more alert, but for the next 3 hours, nothing unusual occurred, and I eventually pushed the matter to the back of my mind. We each had our own assigned aisles to stock, and I hadn't seen Yuri during that time. Around 2 a.m., I had finished all the tasks he had given me for the night, so I went to find him and ask for further instructions. I passed through each aisle until I reached the end of the store, but when I retraced my steps, he was nowhere to be found. I searched the back warehouse and the office, but Yuri remained elusive. I considered the possibility that he was in the restroom or on a break in his car, so I kept myself occupied with work for about 15 minutes before conducting another sweep of the store in search of him. All I discovered was his cart, which he had been using at the beginning of our shift. It seemed like he had stocked about half of the boxes but hadn't had the opportunity to finish. As I noticed this, a sense of unease began to creep over me. I exited the store and scanned the parking lot for any sign of Yuri. His car was parked in the far back near mine, but it was vacant. I even checked around the sides of the building to see if he might be taking a smoke break. It had been nearly 4 hours since I last saw him, and my growing concern led me to call the police. The police had to contact the store director to obtain access to the CCTV camera footage. When they reviewed the recordings, I mentioned the time Yuri had approached me, asking about the person he thought he had seen. We rewound the footage from that point, and indeed, saw someone moving stealthily through the store, attempting to remain concealed and silent. Yuri's observation was correct. There was another person present. We continued watching the footage, and about 30 minutes after Yuri spoke to me, an unknown man appeared and approached Yuri from behind, brandishing a gun. It was chilling to watch the scene, knowing I was only a few aisles away, completely unaware of the situation. The man forcibly directed Yuri, presumably threatening him into silence, and led him out to the rear of the building. There, Yuri was pushed into a car and they drove away. The police believed that the two individuals likely knew each other, and this was a personal attack. Unfortunately, the man was never identified, and as of now, Yuri has yet to resurface. Despite the police's belief that it was a personal attack, I decided not to take any chances and left that job a few weeks later. However, the events of that harrowing night will forever remain etched in my memory.